So, John, before the pandemic hit, what were the biggest financial challenges around managing a major transport system?
Probably a few things to say, but I kind of cover that by talking about three things. I think austerity, I think passenger demand, and that was before the pandemic, and also the lack of integration, certainly outside of London. So starting with austerity, the first thing, the Tideway Transport Levy, that's been cut 8 times in the past 10 years. And in the 2 years where it wasn't cut, it was frozen. So I've done a little calculation, and had the levy increased in line with inflation since 2010, it would have been in excess of £100 million. Instead, it's £59 million in the current year. And those cuts really have been passed on to us because of the savage cuts that have been made to the local authorities' grant from central government in this area. That's meant that we've had to deliver services much more efficiently. We've exploited our other main sources of funding as well. So what I'm talking about there is fares and commercial revenue, particularly in regards to the Tideway Metro system, but also in terms of some of the other services we provide, and also funding that we get direct from the Department for Transport. Now, in terms of the Department for Transport funding, we were in the very fortuitous position to have negotiated in 2010 a long-term funding commitment from DFT. And in the last 5 years, we've seen inflationary uplifts in our revenue grant from the department, as well as an unprecedented amount of investment in renewing life expired assets across the Tideway Metro system. So that's probably booked the trend of what other public sector bodies have had to kind of contend with. And until fairly recently, our fares and commercial revenues, particularly on Metro, had grown. But that's a point I'll just come back to when I talk about passenger demand. So that long-term funding deal with the Department for Transport, it's been excellent for Nexus because it's given us the ability to invest and it's given us that flexibility. But what it has also meant is that our customers have been disrupted like never before, as we've had to close large tranches of the network in order to do those essential renewals work. So that has been a challenge. And that funding agreement also only provided for a refurbishment of the rolling stock, and the trains themselves are 40 years old this year. So you can imagine that, that does become problematic. We've recently made the case for 337 million of capital grant to replace the life expired fleet. But the existing trains are beset by problems. The guys who work in and around the depot do a fantastic job to get that train service out every single day. But from time to time, the trains do break down, and that has also caused further problems for our customers in terms of disruption. And I think also pay austerity has caused us problems in the retention of some key workers. So one set of workers I would particularly focus on is the Metro train crew, the drivers. We've had to put that right because their pay has lagged when you compare them to other train operating companies, drivers on other train operating companies. And we've had to change terms and conditions in order to ensure the smooth introduction of our new fleet of trains as well. So all of that has been problematic in terms of austerity. Passenger demand, there were a range of challenges pre-COVID. So first of all, car ownership, that's been rising in the northeast from a low base compared to other regions. And car mileage in Tyne and Wear in particular has been rising steadily over the last decade. There was a significant increase in 2010. Footfall in our town and city centres has been falling since around 2015. And to give you some illustration of that point, footfall was about 20% lower in 2019 than it was in 2015. And that's obviously been impacted by consumer confidence and the numbers of those claiming job seekers allowance and universal credit. So changing habits, changing lifestyle, that's all also contributed to the challenges of financing the public transport within Tyne and Wear. And the final point I'd make in regards to that question is in regard to the lack of integration. So the model for public transport that we employ in England, outside of London, is very different to that which we see elsewhere in Europe and across the world, in fact. Bus deregulation happened in the 1980s, and that was one of Margaret Thatcher's first privatisation policies. What that's done is it's left a patchwork of different providers, with light rail such as the Tyne-and-Wear Metro provided by public sector entities, whereas bus services are provided by commercial operators. And irrespective of whether you're on the side of the private sector or the public sector in the provision of those essential public services or not, what this has led to is a lack of integration. And by that, I'm particularly referring to integrated ticketing, where there's lots of technological challenges, but they can be overcome. What cannot as easily be overcome is all of the commercial agreements that have to sit behind the technology, and that proves more difficult, and that also provides for additional expense. So I think in terms of the challenges, they probably give you a feel for what some of those challenges were before the pandemic hit.
So I'm going to drill down a little bit into the passenger demand side of things. Obviously, the pandemic has hit, and with lockdown, it's very much kind of driven down passenger numbers. So given you're already experiencing issues with demand, how going forward do you see yourself plugging that financial gap and attracting customers back to the service?
Okay, so the big challenge, I think, is that whilst in the longer term, there's no argument that the Metro must be a powerful force in kickstarting economic recovery and also combating climate change and poor air quality. Even our long-standing, most loyal customers will be wary of returning because of the messages from government to avoid using public transport at the moment. We've taken quick and radical action to make local public transport COVID secure, so people can feel safe and comfortable using it. So by way of example, we undertake deep cleaning of the Metro trains and the station environment. We've got effective signage across the network. We're encouraging our customers to pay by bank card and to use preloaded smart cards, etc. But in reality, people will only travel if they've got somewhere to go. So what you'll also see is Nexus working closely with retailers and leisure attractions on joint promotional activity to support their plans as we move out of lockdown. I think the other thing to say, and I touched on it earlier when I talked about the investment in the new train fleet. So in terms of sustainable transport, we'll be investing more than £500 million over the next 5 years, not just in terms of the new trains, but also in upgrading the track in the South Tyneside area, and that will increase frequency and capacity right across the Metro network. So alongside new ways of paying for travel, we hope that all of those measures will be instrumental in attracting customers back to Metro by making it a better service for everyone.
Okay, I mean, in the midst of all that, as you mentioned, people won't travel if there's nowhere to go, and you are kind of interdependently linked in with the extent to which the rest of the economy opens up. So what are the big challenges at the moment to kind of meaningful long-term financial planning?
Well, I mean, undoubtedly, the pandemic has brought about an unprecedented reduction in passenger numbers. So right at the beginning of lockdown, we were carrying just 5% of our normal loadings. And whilst that steadily increased to around about 20% of late, in fact, the numbers I saw just this morning suggested last week we were at about 25%. We had really exceptional weather. It was taking a lot of people to the beach. That brings in itself other issues around social distancing and being able to police that. But quite clearly, even if we're at 20 or 25%, the position is unsustainable unless we do get passengers returning to something close to pre-COVID levels. But just as we don't know when that will be, and to give you a sense of our losses, we were 7 million adrift in periods 1 and 2 of the first, in the first 2 periods of the financial year, and we estimate that our total revenue losses across the year could be in the range of £30 million. And that's really based on what we've experienced to date, the length of time we were in lockdown, the gradual easing of those measures, and also that clear message from government, which really isn't helpful because what they're saying is that people should avoid using public transport. And I think it's rather ironic that unless you live in Leicester, you can go to the pub this weekend, but just not by public transport. So that brings me back to the earlier point about making Metro COVID secure. in the here and now, and also a more attractive proposition in the longer term. Meantime, we're placing huge reliance on government funding. The Department of Transport have already provided 16.2 million for Metro from the period 17th of March through to the 4th of August, and we are working with civil servants to make the case for this funding to continue. And our losses aren't just about Metro, so we're also in receipt of emergency funding for some of our bus services. This only runs until the 9th of June, and whilst this is relatively small beer in comparison to Metro, we again are making the case for this funding to continue as well. And then another issue in terms of long-term financial planning for us is that we've been directed by government to make funding available to commercial bus operators who, like the Metro, have also seen unprecedented reductions in passenger numbers and also fare revenue. And that's meant Nexus, along with other travel concession authorities throughout England, having to reimburse for concessionary travel, even though the numbers of those using the various concessions have all but disappeared. I'm really talking about the free bus pass in that regard. So I think all of that, together with the uncertainty surrounding when passengers return to those pre-COVID levels, makes long-term financial planning extremely difficult for us at Nexus.
Some really interesting insights there, and given all of the challenges, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.